Bonjour, my name's Emilia Wilton-Godberfforde and I'm a lecturer in French at the Open University. I'm a 17th century specialist and have been focusing on theatre of the period for some time now. I first encountered Moliere when I was 17 and studied Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme at school, and I've loved watching plays, working on texts and researching Moliere for many years. Today we'll be focusing on Le Tartuffe, a comedy that was first written by Moliere in 1664, although the text we read today is the 1669 version, and it was originally written in 1664, and we're going to talk about the evolution of that text later on. The frontispiece from an early edition that I have included here shows one of the key scenes of the play, namely when Emilia asks her husband Orgon to hide under the table so she can unmask Tartuffe and show him, her husband, the real man that he is, not the pious spiritual counsellor he purports to be. I've included also three key quotations. The first one, Et Tartuffe, which is said by Orgon repeatedly. He's told that his wife has been very ill, but all he cares about is his spiritual director. Et Tartuffe. Another one said by Tartuffe himself when he feigns shock at the low-cut top of the mistress. Couvrez ce sein que je ne saurais voir. Often misquoted as cachez ce sein, but it's couvrez ce sein. And finally, ah, pour être un dévot, je n'en suis pas moins homme. Although he is a devout man, I'm no less a man, he says. And of course he doesn't openly declare this to others, but he does want Emilia to know that he is a man of flesh and blood who has desires as he frighteningly pursues her. This is the introductory video. The second video will focus more on the different aspects that we'll be covering today. I would like to give you a brief overview. We'll be doing an activity 1 with the cover illustrations. Then I'm going to talk about some useful scholarly additions. I'm going to give you a brief background to the 17th century theatre. And of course, we can't mention the 17th century in France without talking about Louis XIV, the Sun King. I'm going to focus a little bit more on Moliere, the playwright, and you'll get given a chance to explore a website that provides lots of information about his other works. The second video will then turn to look at the history of the play, focusing on different themes as well, namely hypocrisy, on what this word means, the religious connotations of hypocrisy, and the idea of the parasite. And then you will analyse a scene chosen in which Tartuffe brilliantly lies by telling the truth. We're then going to focus on some versions, translations and adaptations, and in conclusion we'll wrap it all up. I'll also give you some tips for taking it further. I hope you enjoy. So for this activity, I'd like you to spend 10 minutes looking at the different cover illustrations of these different published versions of Tartuffe, and ask yourself, firstly, what is the image depicting? And secondly, what do you think the designer is trying to highlight and bring out in the play? What are they trying to emphasize? Do this in French. You can do this together in groups or independently. So thirdly, ask yourself, if you were going to design a cover for this play, what would you draw? And what do you think is the most important feature that needs our attention? So you'll probably have a particular edition that you're working from at school, but I would like to emphasize the importance of working with a scholarly edition, i.e. with notes in the back that provides some context, has an introduction, and glosses certain vocabulary. This version on the left, Richard Parish wrote in 2004. So you have Moliere's text, you have an excellent introduction, and then you have a glossary. He's very good at talking about religious language in the text, bringing the scenes together, showing echoes that happen across the text, and also sort of articulating the architectures of the scene, and also looking at the rhetorical, that's in the persuasive devices of in rhetorical devices shown in the speeches of the characters. I think it's very important that you work slowly through the language. I know it's not as difficult as Shakespeare, but it's not easy when you first encounter Moliere. So take your time, study each scene carefully, work through the dialogues, look at how the verse functions. We've got Alexandrin. And ask yourself, you can have a translation, but don't rely on the translation. Try and unpick it for yourself and unpack what's going on. Write summaries of each scene for yourself and really use the notes. There's another scholarly edition I would recommend. This was the Georges Forestier and Claude Borqui version that appeared in 2010. It's probably the most recent scholarly edition that had excellent notes and a background to the evolution of the play, and also in the notice he spends a lot of time talking about the evolution of the character of Tartuffe across the editions, and also the figure of the hypocrite. So it's very dense, but if you can get hold of this, I highly recommend it. It's important to look at the evolution of the text, and we'll be doing so. As I said, there are three versions: 1664, 1667, 1669. And although we don't have the 1664, 1667 versions, I think what's important is that it illustrates the controversy and the nature of the controversy. And also it shows us what was particularly offensive to the particular group that petitioned to have it banned, and what really we think Moliere wanted to highlight in the play. And he says in his defense, he argues what the play is about in the preface, and we will look at that. So it's important to remember that the 17th century in France was a time where the theatre was really flourishing. This was actively encouraged by the first Cardinal, Richelieu, and also Louis XIV. And so this gave the theatre political and national importance. So Richelieu was a politician and patron of the arts who was responsible for the creation of the Académie Française, but also Louis XIV, the king, the Sun King, was a towering figure of the 17th century France and the patron of the arts. He himself performed in some of the ballets and was a great lover of the theatre. Lots of theatres were built, purpose-built for the time. Before there'd been a lot of street theatre and travelling troupes, but the theatre became very important. Opera also flourished at the time. So really the theatre in 17th century France achieved a prominence which in many ways eclipsed other art forms. So to know the 17th century in France is to know the great dramatists. So the three big names I'm going to give you: Pierre Corneille, who's most known for Le Cid. He wrote comedies, but he also wrote tragedies. And so Corneille, Moliere, who wrote comedies, and Racine, who wrote tragedies. I'm not going to talk about the genre of tragedy today, but it's important to remember that there are lots of genres at the time. There's comedy, there's also tragicomédie, and there's tragedy. And comedy, there's farces, there's higher comedy, and comedy became more sophisticated throughout the period. But it's important to remember that although there are disturbing dimensions to Tartuffe, it was written in the genre of comedy, and it is specifically a comedy, as we'll see. So what can we focus on when looking at what is comedy? Of course, there's the comedy of gestures, the slapstick dimension, the tumbles, the fighting, the movement across the stage. And Moliere, being an actor as well as a playwright, was very well versed in this agile movement. And you can see this in his plays. The comedy of language, which really plays with the sounds of language and the rhythmic effect of dialogue, and something that we come up across in Moliere many times. The comedy of characters. This is often the sort of set characters, archetypal characters, were based on the street theatre of the Italians, the Commedia dell'arte, that made their way to France. And the Commedia dell'arte characters, the old man, the Senex, and the young lovers, are taken and then really fleshed out more with Moliere. A comedy of situation, a set situation where somebody tries to dominate and is thwarted, there's turmoil, and then conflict is resolved and ending in harmony is really the situation par excellence of comedy. And it's watching that tangling and disentangling that is really the comic mechanism. And the comedy of manners, of how people behave, la comédie de mœurs, is something that Moliere is very good at engaging with. So he wrote earlier in his career farce, and he wrote very short comedies, and then he developed his style and began writing more in verse. And you can see the Misanthrope, Don Juan, for example, and Tartuffe are written in verse. So Moliere was born in 1622 and he died in 73 after writing the Malade Imaginaire, where he performed on stage as the sick man, ironically, because he was very sick at the end of his career. I want you to spend some time looking at other Moliere plays. There's a good, excellent website which I'm provided on the next slide. And I want you to spend some time reading about the other plays he performed. All of Moliere's plays center around an obsession, the obsession of one character. Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme is about Monsieur Jourdain, who has an obsession to be a gentilhomme. Don Juan is a play about a man who has an obsession for women and pursues them much to the chagrin of all around him. L'Avare is a play about Harpagon, who's obsessed with money and hoarding it. And in L'École des Femmes, the central figure, Arnulf, is obsessed with keeping his bride pure and obsessed with not being cuckolded, that he even locks her up. They're thwarted, and their obsession is shown for all its ridiculous and disturbing dimensions. I've provided some other links which I encourage you to look at. I would spend about 20 minutes looking at the site above to Moliere, where you can learn about the other plays. It's important to see the kind of continuity in Moliere's. The characters re-emerge, the themes re-emerge. Don Juan is very interesting in relation to Tartuffe. So if there was another play that I would recommend you read, it's that one.